As we kick off season 12, we are asking a simple but essential question. We say that we want schools to be prepared for the real world, but what does it actually look like to design a school around that priority? In this first episode of the season, we explore how the Big Picture Schools Network has built a model that aligns values with practice and what that means for teaching, learning, and creativity.
Today, we welcome to the show Carlos Moreno, who is a teacher, principal, a director, and now a chief executive officer. A proud native New Yorker, Carlos is a passionate educator, trailblazer, committed to supporting school and district leaders to create high-quality, non-traditional schools designed to tackle systemic issues related to equity in education. He currently serves as executive director for Big Picture Learning, a nonprofit organization that, since 1995, has developed over 150 such schools in the United States and throughout the world. He also co-founded and leads the Deeper Learning Equity Fellowship in partnership with the International Network for Public Schools and is the author of the book, Finding Your Leadership Soul. Welcome to the show, Carlos.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me, Cindy and Matt.
So, Carlos, you have been in many different roles. And so from this systems level vantage point, where do you see the greatest constraints in traditional public education models? And where do you see the greatest untapped creative potential?
I'll start by saying that, like most people working in public education are deeply creative human beings, right? Teachers, advisors, counselors, principals, some of the most inventive folks I have met and that I know. And I think that the tragedy is that the systems that they work inside of often don't trust them, right? And the greatest constraint in my mind, and based on what I've seen, is time combined with compliance. All right. And what we've done, we've organized schools around coverage, pacing, guides, testing windows, bell schedules. Everything is chopped into pieces. But when you compress time and then layer on fear, quite honestly, right? Fear of scores, fear of being labeled a quote unquote failing school, fear of deviating or deviation, like creativity becomes this risky thing. And when creativity is risky, people default to survival, right? We've seen that even happen in some of our own work. And I'd say another big constraint is that we confuse standardization with equity sometimes, oftentimes. Somewhere along the way, equity became about everyone getting the same exact thing at the same time in the same way, rather than everyone getting what they need to thrive. And framing squeezes out, that type of framing squeezes out imagination, the ability to think and be free within. And I know that Dr. Bettina Love has coined as freedom dreaming in the midst of education. But the untapped potential, I think it's enormous, and it lives in relationships and local context. Like, so when schools are allowed to root learning in young people's lives, their questions, their curiosities, their neighborhoods, their histories, that's when we've seen that creativity just explodes. Like the moment we stop asking, how do we get students to fit school or fit this school, and start asking, how do we shape a school around young people, like things that opens up. And it's really a big part of the genesis of Big Picture Learning. And the potential is also just honestly is that students themselves, it is the students themselves. We wildly underestimate how curious, how capable, and how creative young people are when they're trusted with real work, real problems, and real audiences. And that just kind of gives them purpose, proximity to the world, and adults who believe in them. And they just surprise us every time when we do that.
I got a very quick follow-up question around your experience as a teacher, a principal, district leader, and now CEO. You spoke about fear. Just out of curiosity, are there different senses of fear within these roles? does the fear increase as you kind of go up the administrative ladder, or do you feel that the fear is perhaps most prominent within a teaching and learning environment such as the classroom?
I would say that, the system that I grew up within big picture system as a teacher, right? I didn't I didn't have to operate within that fear. And I do know that the folks at the system level were the ones that were ensuring and trying to ensure that we had the coverage, protection, and safety to continue to be creative and support us in the ability to do that. Now, when I was no longer working within, let's say, a big picture system or structure, and was, I'd say in a lot of ways exposed as a professional to the other systems, it has been a trickle down effect, right?
Mm,
So when you have system leaders who are being held accountable from perhaps the state or whomever, right, whatever the body is, and it just trickles down and it becomes this practice of compliance. Um, you know, I can't say that there's one over the other, but it definitely, I don't believe it starts at the school level. It's definitely at the system level.
It's a tough one, that, isn't it? Because I always wrestle with this because there's always funding that typically is coming outside of the school, particularly in public
Hmm.
education. So one of the challenges that we have is when we provide funding, we usually have goals and things that
Yeah.
we hope to happen with that. But quite often, do you think there's a slight disconnect with not having enough people with the background, the education background,
mm,
crafting up these policies?
It's fascinating because when you reference kind of the system and the decision makers and indirectly mentioning folks who perhaps aren't educators, right, or are not from within the system. A big picture co-founder Dennis Litkey wrote a book, which was the big picture.
mm,
Education is everyone's business, right?
mm,
And for us as a school design that works in tandem and in partnership with local community folks who we
mm,
do want young people to be exposed to and be able to learn from people within the community. Folks that perhaps are not educators, but we also know that those are the folks that could also be some of the most powerful teachers for
mm,
young people, right?
mm,
So I want to separate your question into two parts, right? Like I think that folks who are not trained educators can be phenomenal educators for young people and have places, there's a space and a way for them to contribute to the lives and to the
mm,
learning of young people. Now, in terms of, I feel like what I'm hearing, Matt, is that there are some people in the system who are making decisions
mm.
who are not educators and who don't know and are just like kind of pushing buttons and just are looking at it from a business standpoint. Is that about right? Am I
I
capturing your
I mean,
question right?
I think so. I think, and to put it, something that Cindy and I have spoken about on occasion, we speak with researchers, and they come up with really valuable insights from their research. But sometimes when
Hmm.
you're having a conversation with them, you're like, as they're translating that research into ideas for schooling and how to improve schooling, it's a case of, you know what, listening to you, you don't have enough experience of what it's like to be in a classroom. And so I
Yeah.
understand the goal. So it's more of that disconnect, bridging the gap between research, bridging the gap between goals for the economy, bridging the gap between identifying the skills that we think everyone must graduate with, and then actually being on the ground and developing those skill sets. They're
Mm,
not the same thing. And sometimes it feels like, here's the goal, education, go do it. And oh, by the way, we're only going to give you a couple of years before we start seeing the results. And
mm,
Yeah.
mm,
Understood. And I agree with those comments. So without question, I think that when the decisions are being made with and for students, those and the experiences that students are having, ultimately, that the educators, the folks who are most proximate to those students, should be involved in the design and the decision making. I'll also share, and what you'll hear from me on this conversation is I'm a firm believer that multiple things can be true, right?
mm,
So you could have folks who are
mm,
very passionate, well-intended, who are come at it from a perspective and want to do good and want to be helpful and believe that their way is the right way, and can also do harm, right? In that same vein. And it's about the leadership, right? Like whoever is the or the few decision makers that make that call to consistently ask the question, who is not in this room? Who should be in this conversation? And
Mm,
what might we be missing here? Right.
mm,
And I've
mm,
seen spaces where that happens. And I've seen spaces where that's completely disregarded. Right.
mm,
So I think it's a, in some cases it can be a tale of two cities, two communities, two states, right? Like
mm,
you just don't, it varies.
So, in regard to this, we're a creativity podcast.
Yes.
Is where how does creativity fit in here? Because we know that industry, even if they don't necessarily use the words creativity, we know we want people who are going to go out, solve problems, innovate, and help our economy grow and prosper, and ideally also hope the individuals and citizens go on to be wonderful citizens as well.
Yeah, as I shared in some my response to the opening question, what often happens is this constraint of time, right?
mm,
And even the license for that freedom, right? Um, and it's creativity in service of what, right? Like we want to be creative. Like some people might be like, "Oh, you have art class. That's a space where you can be creative." Yes, and what is the applicability to what young people
mm,
are figuring out, thinking about,
mm,
engaging in to their real, like, for us, we're always going to talk about their community, their real world, their aspirations when they leave our doors.
mm,
Um, and I always feel like this is where there's a space for industry, right? Like for professionals, for other people, right? Like in across industries, there's folks are engaged in creative thinking, redesign, and thinking outside of the norm and what is now. Um, and oftentimes, in most systems, I would say the outside world, right, that's not within the school, isn't aren't aren't intentionally being let in, right? Aren't invited in,
mm,
right? Aren't treated or brought in as partners in thinking about, hey, this is we're trying to prepare our young people for X. This
mm.
is what we're good at. This is what we know we can do. But here are some areas that we know that, in terms of industry and interest that our young people have, there's a space for exposure. And that's honestly, I think, if it's a first step that I would say is like just exposing young people to other things that beyond what they know at that moment.
And I think what's so impressive about this is getting students at the high school level exposed to things that they're interested in and passionate about and they want to learn about is you're giving them these lifelong learning skills to really want
Mm,
to continue learning. And that's one of the things I find most interesting about this model. And as you know, as I mentioned to you before we started, I have a wonderful friend and colleague, Karen Monaco, so shout out to her, who
shout
listens
out.
to our podcast and said, you have to bring on one of our CEOs, Carlos, and she is a vice principal at a big picture school, which I have
Mm,
gone and taught with some of the students at that school. And what I found amazing is they were working on TED Talks and trying to uncover what they were interested in to talk about for their little TEDx talks. And I shouldn't say little, they were I think that's amazing that high school students would have this opportunity to be able to do a TED talk in high school. And I was thinking when I left the school, I wonder how this fits in with the standard public education because this school is within Buffalo. Our Buffalo public schools here are not doing so well. In fact, they just incentivized public Buffalo public schools students with $200 to $500 if they come to school, that they do a lottery for students who come to school. And I find this like
mm,
gobsmacking. I'm like, are we solving the wrong problem here? Because I would much rather see kids have an opportunity to explore their interests versus giving them money
mm,
to go to school, right?
mm.
So here's my question. Sorry, this is long
Yeah,
winded.
yeah. No, no, I appreciate that framing though.
My question is, why aren't all schools like this? How do you fit the big picture schools into the standards so that you can be public education, so that you can offer this to students of all, you know, different demographics and, in different environments, so that they can explore the things that they're really interested in, because it's so important. But I just don't think that people see that in the framing of our current standards.
So we have a little over 130 schools across 30 plus states in the US, and then we have a growing international network of schools that we're really proud of.
Hmm.
And many folks will look at us and say, "You've been around 30 years. How come you only have 100 and something schools in the US?" Um, which is a fascinating question to me, especially
Just
for
to
those of us.
just to throw it out there, I don't think it's fascinating. I think that's crazy. So when I was looking at it, I was like, that is a lot of schools that you
Hmm.
have, across the
Yeah,
country, and the fact you're
yeah.
expanding beyond. So I don't know if that's what you were saying was a fascinating question, but I would just say that I think it's an incredible
Uh,
success to
um,
have that
um,
many schools running successfully.
I'm gonna let you be my Luther in the background when I say things that are a little more PC. I'm gonna let you, Matt, just go in and just say exactly what I'm thinking. I appreciate that. Um, and our hope and our desire was always to be able to demonstrate that this type of design and school model can be successful in a variety of contexts, in all spaces, for all types of young people, right? All types of learners. But we do get it. And I have personally been in conversations with chief executives of school systems in their office, talking with them, explaining our design and model, letting them know where we are, the successes that we've been having, being truthful about the challenges and the how hard it is, without saying how hard it is, right?
Hmm.
And I've had a number of superintendents specifically look me in my face and be like, "That is incredibly hard to do." And I'm like, "You're damn right, it's really hard to do, right?" And anything that's worth doing is going to take some effort and redesign. And especially just because it's difficult, it's not the reason not to do it.
Hmm.
So, and it's a transfer of power, right? Of control. There's a little bit of that, right? In terms of the existing conventional education model is focused on control of students, right?
Hmm.
Know exactly where they are, what they're working on in any given moment. This is what they're learning. This is how we're going to assess them, and this is how we're going to make the decision if they're ready to move on to the next piece. Versus that being able to be a slightly more fluid conversation, because in most industries, and again, in thinking about the real world, it's more it's more of the latter, right? We're able to talk about the goals that we're setting, especially as we're talking about like older grades. I want to draw that distinction, right? We operate in the K to 12 space, but our sweet spot has been 6 through 12,
Hmm.
right? So as young people are in and approaching adolescence and wanting and looking and deserving of more freedom and space to just to 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 think more freely and communicate and voice their interests, right? And push back and engage in that beautiful bidirectional, just kind of like exercise of like, yeah, I don't agree. That is, I think, highly uncomfortable for a lot of folks.
Hmm.
Um, um, and at the same time, I think here's a multiple things being true. There is what we are seeing is a growing segment of folks that are seeing our schools, that are seeing, and not just our schools, but schools that are the models that are much more innovative, and saying the type of thinkers and students, um, that these schools are producing, right, or helping to develop, is what we need in this world. And but it's still at feels like it's at a crawl's pace, right? It's not at the speed that we think. Like, again, we're 30 years in, right?
Hmm.
Um, and if you think of schools like Montessori schools, like they've been going on for forever. So, um, yeah, what I have heard is, it's hard to do, and what I know it has been, it's been a fear of losing control of what is happening in the school and
Hmm.
not knowing where things might go.
Hmm.
I'd like to build on this a little bit because I've referenced this on the show before. I used to work at the Center for 21st Century Skills about 15 years ago now, and we was working with about 10 Connecticut high schools. Then we received some funding from Obama's Investing in Innovation grant. So we was to create this Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences, which was to go, and put our program as almost like a school within a school, and we'd identify a specific cohort from ninth grade, and they'll go through it, and we would in essence provide that curriculum for those STEM subjects. And one of the challenges I know we experienced was that the model just needed to be tweaked to such an extent at different schools that it was almost like everybody was doing their own thing. And so we tried to express the values, we tried to make it about technology, real world projects, but ultimately it looks so different from 10 schools. You was ultimately feeling like you was kind of running 10 different programs. And so it's very difficult sometimes bringing them all together. So I was wondering if, within your model, do you find that same challenge with the fact that you're having to tweak and modify certain things for some schools? And you referenced the community, and I'd love to talk a little bit about the community in more detail. And which are the values that you try to maintain? So even as you're modifying and tweaking things, what are those main values you say, this is what we need to practice? It can be modified, but these are the values and behaviors that we're nurturing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. So without question, depending on the context, community, circumstance, and place, there are certain factors that we need to take into consideration when establishing a partnership with a school district, a system. The big picture design has 10 distinguishers, right? That when they were established 30 years ago, and you looked at them, they're like, oh my gosh, these are so innovative. Like all 10 of these in a school, that would be amazing. And now if we look at them, I think in most cases, most of them we'd be like, yeah, these are absolutely necessary and best practices. Any school that are doing some of these or most of these should, and really valuing them. It's better. They're highly better than the schools that maybe we attended. And we do have 4 very what I would call high lever distinguishers that for us are pretty non-negotiable around the design. How they look and shape and exist and breathe within the school is slightly different, but there are 4. So there's the space around the one student at a time, ensuring that every young person has an opportunity to voice and communicate a little bit about the things that they're interested in, the things that they're curious in. There's an opportunity for the school to connect deeply with that person's family and guardians and community in some sort of way. That gives us a different entry point into who that student, that young person is. And it's important for us to know that student well. So there has to be a space and opportunity to do that. And the way that also happens, the second, in terms of ingredients of secret sauce, would be that the advisory system. Now, a lot of schools would sadly state that they have advisory systems, but they're sadly in a lot of cases, they're nothing more than a glorified homeroom. That's not what this is. Not a place where you take attendance and make announcements. This is actually a place where you build community with young people, and they build community with each other. Right? I referenced that bi-directional kind of relationship that's important between adults and young people. If you have one adult that's got you and is with you for the duration of however you're in that school, and is going to ride with you, that is, I think, as a former advisor, I'd say that's transformational and actually leads to lifelong relationships. The learning in the real world, again, we're about experiential hands-on learning. So ensuring that, in some of our schools as early as, 6th and 7th graders, they're going out on a regular basis, whether individually or in small groups, but learning in the real world and being exposed to industries and adults who are, that are doing things that they're curious about, right? Maybe they don't know exactly what they want to do, but here's an opportunity for exposure. What are the things that connect to their interests that they're doing? How are the disciplines built into, how the different content areas built into the work that they do? And again, our hope is that a graduate of one of our high schools is that, has a much better sense than they would otherwise around what it is that they'd like to do next, right? Because they've had that experience and they've talked to people in the field. And then the fourth ingredient would be just an opportunity to present publicly your learning, right? It's a bit of a defense of your learning. How do you talk about what you've learned, right? There's a space for your more conventional summative and formative assessments. There's like that gives you some data, right? But this an opportunity to engage in a conversation, talk about your work, talk about the things that you're proudest around, talk about what you've learned. Also have an opportunity to be challenged around the work, right? And defend your work in this public way. What we've seen is students take those very, very, very seriously, right? In terms of, and there's a lot of pride, right? Because of the audience. So for us, those are the four, right? Now, what might change in terms of context to your question, Matt, is like cadences of those, right? For us, like, exhibitions should happen 4 times a year. In some places, they happen twice a year, right? Because of some design challenges, scheduling challenges that we talked about. Advisory is a pretty regular thing for us. It can't just happen once a week. It needs to happen multiple times. So they need to be significant time, significant. They just need to be significant placements in the schedule, right? They like 15 minutes is not an advisory. 20 minutes is not an advisory. And if you're doing 30 minutes, it needs to happen pretty consistently and frequently. Internships is often the most challenging one, right? Because this also comes along with funding and resources depending on your community and how you get and transport young people to other places. And again, there's the control question around, wait, our young people are out in the real world 2 days a week?
Wow.
Yeah. In some cases, 2 days a week. In some cases, it's 1 day a week. But that has to happen with some level of frequency. And then for the one student at a time piece is that how does your schedule allow for your advisor to have one-on-one check-ins with the students, right? Like, where does that happen within the flow of the day, right? Within the flow of the school day, how do you create a space where every young person within that advisor's advisory and within that group can have a one-on-one check-in with their advisor? In some cases, it happens weekly. In some cases, it happens every other week. So I think those are some of to your point, some of the concessions, just to get really granular on it. It's kind of some of the way we've had to adjust and accommodate.
Well, it also speaks to the idea that it's that one student at a time. It's not that factory model. And one of the things that the last themes that have been the last few seasons, I'd say, Cindy, relationships, right? We've had a lot of conversations about the importance of relationships and mentorships. And I think what I'm hearing ultimately is what Cindy and I have put as our last chapter is about educating the whole person. Right. And it's not about the content. We're living in a world where you have so much access to content. But when you go out in the real world and you get to see how this information is being applied. I remember a student literally just a couple of months ago, he was talking about one of my classes. He was talking about design thinking. So I'm teaching about what design thinking is. We're going through the different stages. I'm trying to talk about how this looks and feels differently depending on your domain and context. But they said it only really came clear to them when we went and checked out a space in Stamford, Connecticut, where we was actually seeing the design thinking process take place at a synchrony. And then we saw the design thinking process in essence take place at one of GE's co-action labs. And when they saw it in the real world, then they was able to make that connection. And is this something I'm interested in, but also something I'm not interested in? This is not just about teaching the content. That's one of the things. It's about educating that person. And even, 100%. Making a commitment to stand up and speak and articulate your learning. To Cindy, to your point, it might be a TED Talk. And that might be one shape it takes. But other times we can think there's lots of other avenues for people to kind of like, articulate their learning in public. But just think about what you have to go through, how you have to persevere. It's not just about public speaking. There is so much that goes in trying to create a narrative that you're going to communicate to people to defend your learning or express what you've learned. It's so much more. It feels so much more, but in some ways it's not that much if you think about it.
Agreed.
And Matt, I just want to build on that because you're talking about relationships, and we haven't had a chance yet, and we're already 31 minutes in. We haven't had a chance yet to talk about Carlos's book, which is called Finding Your Leadership Soul. And I was able to dig into a lot of this book before today. And I just want to say, Carlos, it's based on these three principles you talk about, which is leading with love, care, and vulnerability. And I felt that as I was reading the book. I felt the love and care and vulnerability in your writing and telling of your story. So thank you for that. So tell us more about where this leadership soul comes from and finding your leadership soul, and what advice you would give to educators and administrators out there who want to find their leadership soul. How do you build that?
Yeah, thank you for spending time with the book. I still um, at times can't believe that there's this thing that's been authored and put out there with my name on it, and elevating the stories of three young men who I knew really, really well, knew them intimately, knew them, like grew with them, learned from them. Who are the three young men who are on the cover and the features of the book, and who are sadly no longer with us. So I just also want to always honor Josue, Andy, and Sean, and all their gifts. So I'll, I'll start off by saying that for me, love, care, and vulnerability aren't soft ideas. They're actually design principles in so many ways. Um, Love shows up when schools say, "We see you, we know you, you matter here." Creative learning requires like psychological safety, right? Students don't take risk if they feel invisible or disposable. When a young person knows at least one adult who genuinely has their back, as I had shared, right? They're far more willing to try, to make mistakes, to revise, to imagine something new. Um, and care, if we talk about the elements of love, care, and vulnerability, care shows up in how intentionally we design experiences. Like creativity isn't chaos. It's thoughtful. It's a thoughtful structure with flexibility. And caring schools, what I would say for the educators that want to think about, these are the elements of leadership soul. When you think about caring, folks that are in and work within on behalf of caring schools ask, is this work meaningful to the student? Right? Does it connect to the real world? And are we honoring their culture, their language, and their identity? And care for me is the difference between a project that's cute, right, and one that's transformative for a young person. Um, and then vulnerability, in terms of the last element of leadership soul, is, that's the hardest one, right? Adults modeling vulnerability changes everything, right? When an educator can say, "I don't have all the answers," I don't, or just I don't know, I actually don't know, or let's figure this out together. They give students permission to be learners and not performers, right? That kind of it helps them see us remove our armor that so many of us walk into classrooms with, and be like, oh, you know, he, she, they are not going to front and say like, yep, they have all the answers. This is a one directional relationship. It's when we can figure this out together. And I would say creative schools are places where just adults are willing to unlearn alongside with kids. There's a lot of things that we as adults that have learned through very conventional experiences, that we carry with us, and that takes courage. So when leaders model that, it ripples. It ripples through the entire culture. So the first thing I would say in terms of leadership soul is honestly reminding ourselves what it is that called us to work with and for and on behalf of young people in schools, right? In most cases, it wasn't this idea of this particular content. We might love our content, right? But I want to firmly believe that for most of us that made the decision to be educators, we love the idea of working with young people, right? And ask ourselves, what does it mean if we had to put our content aside and work with young people? Will we still be as excited to do that? And if the answer is like yes, and if we even get more excited, that's definitely a space, right, where we talk about leadership, soul, and creativity. So
Carlos, we end every episode asking our guests to share about their most creative educational experience, what it was, either formal or informal, and the impact that it had on you. And if you'd like to share about a teacher that within that story, that would be great.
yeah. So I'm in finding your leadership soul. I I mentioned the amazing Cheryl Williams that for me, I refer to her as my Bronx angel.
Mm,
So there was a moment in time in my journey where I was making, as a teenage boy growing up in New York City, I was making some really unhealthy decisions based on a pretty traumatic experience I had had. And Cheryl was a community organizer in the Bronx, and she was the one that actually um, invited me to do something different. So
mm,
the reason why I always think of Cheryl is she was the advisor that exists within our schools outside of the school setting. So she was a person that took a level of care and wanted to know, what was going on with me, had heard what had happened, did I need a job, help me facilitate landing an amazing summer experience, which was like my first teaching experience at a daycare, working all summer, working with 3, 4, and 5-year-olds with two of my best buddies. Now, mind you, this is three black men all over 6'4", working in a playground in the Bronx at a daycare center with tiny kids. Um, Amazing experience, but it was Cheryl, right, who saw that in us. Of course, the need to be able to make some money, you know, legally, but also an opportunity to say, hey, what the world is showing you, what you need to be doing, you have this experience to have some joy. So it was the first time that I was able to see, really, besides my own family, kind of the family structures that existed. It was an opportunity for me to see, hey, I'm noticing that most of the people that are picking up their kids are moms and drop off, where are the dads? This is where I noticed that, why some of the kids gravitated to us the way they did. And we were the only men that worked at the daycare. Um, it gave me a peek into a lot of the inequities that exist in our societies, a lot of the challenges that exist in our society. Um, and Cheryl, not only did she place us there, right, or help us land the position, but also helped us in processing that kind of what we were experiencing, because we had tons of questions and we were just 17-year-old boys trying to figure it out, and learning. So Cheryl Williams, um, non-traditional teacher, but probably the best teacher educator I've ever had.
Thank you.
And of course, that's that relationship and mentorship piece again, because that story is very much about you and your personal growth as opposed to teaching content, and of course exposure, right? The exposure you got on that playground as you're interacting with those young kids, and finding a different part of you and your future. So, Carlos, thank you so much. Hopefully, this isn't the one and only interview we have around big picture schools. I think there's a lot more of the story to unpack along the way, but I think this was a really great episode to get us started, to think a little bit about that, particularly those 4 levers that you were referencing, and maybe Cindy and I will revisit that in our debrief episode. If you enjoyed this and you're interested in alternative schooling, please share this with a friend or colleague. And don't forget to visit our website, Fueling Creativity in Education Podcast, where you can also subscribe to our Extra Fuel newsletter. And also, we do want to do a quick shout out to our YouTube channel as we make an effort to continue to be good with our shorts and getting more content out there. We do have a YouTube channel, and we encourage you to subscribe to that as well. My name's Dr. Matthew Wowood.
And my name is Dr. Cindy Burnett. This episode was produced by Cindy Burnett and Matthew Warwood. Our podcast assistant is Ann Fernando, and our editor is Sheikh Ahmed.